Hello, I'm Professor G, and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to explain to you how the antebellum South was not simply a society with slaves, rather it was a slave society. And I think that this is very important because, especially in the United States today, where there are many Confederate apologetics and people who want to support what was the antebellum South and what became the Confederate States of America, they try and lighten the burden of slavery being the foundation for that society. And you see that. You see that through a lot of people who promote that, the lost cause of the Confederacy and things like that. However, the antebellum South was truly a distinct nation from the industrializing North, from the early Republic all the way up through the antebellum period to the Civil War. So the fact that the Civil War happened and that secession was entirely based on the preservation of slavery was not something that, looking back in history, is very surprising. But you do get people who say not every white Southerner owned slaves, therefore not everyone was fighting for the protection of slavery, not everyone was, cared about slavery. You've heard all of the arguments before. However, that's simply not true. The entire Southern way of life, the antebellum way of life, was based around this racial hierarchy that was founded in the system of African slavery. So it is true, and you look up and you get different data points, but for the most part, around 30% of white families in the antebellum South owned at least one enslaved person. So 31% clearly is not 100%. So yes, not everyone owned a slave during the antebellum period. And I believe it's something like only 2% of white Southerners owned more than 200 slaves, or what would be considered one of these large plantations that you think of. And so while the point must be conceded that yes, not every white person owned slavery, that doesn't mean that they weren't deeply invested in the system of slavery and the racial hierarchy and the privilege that that position afforded them as simply being a white person in the antebellum South. Even if that was a poor white person, you find that even the poor whites in the South still hung their hats on the fact that they believed themselves to be ethnically and racially superior than those enslaved peoples, and they banked on that. They wanted that. And even though only, let's take that number of 31% owned one enslaved person, it is not so far out of line to say that the majority of people in the antebellum South either worked with or, as I've said, benefited from the institution of slavery and the racial hierarchy that the laws created around it. So that's important. And again, we're going to go back today to an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery of the United States, written by Thomas R.R. Cobb. And if you haven't seen my previous lessons, please go look at those because it's important to understand who he was. A real quick refresher: he was a very famous jurist in the antebellum South. He was an attorney from Georgia. He wrote this volume on the laws of slavery in the United States, and courts in the antebellum South actually cited this book. He was known as the James Madison of the Confederacy, James Madison being the father of the U.S. Constitution. Thomas Cobb was considered the father of the Confederate Constitution. So this isn't just some random book picked up from the antebellum period. This is what attorneys who were arguing issues dealing with slaves in courts would have used, and what courts themselves actually cited. So he actually talks about the importance of the distinction between the superior class and the Africans enslaved in this book on law, and talks about how important that distinction actually is. And he's not referencing slave owner or master and slave, but superior race and people of African descent. So clearly it shows from writings of the period that just because you didn't own a slave didn't mean that you didn't benefit from and or want or have position of authority within this system. So he writes, reason of policy and necessity require that so long as two races of men live together, the one as masters and the other as dependents and slaves, to a certain extent all of the superior race shall exercise a controlling power over the inferior. If the slave feels that he is solely under the power and control of his immediate master, he will soon become insolent and ungovernable to all others. If the white man had then no right by law to control, the result would be the excitement of angry passions, broils, and bloodshed. And then he says, hence have arisen in the states various police and patrol regulations giving to white persons, other than the masters, under certain circumstances, the right of controlling and in some cases correcting slaves. So he clearly says that in order for this system of slavery to work, where slavery is based on, and go watch my previous lessons, the idea of a superior ethnicity, a superior race controlling and dominating for their own good an inferior race, if that system is going to exist, then there must be a distinction between those races and power given to all people in the superior class to, in certain situations, take and control and dominate that enslaved class. So that's important. He actually talks about this. There is a distinction between the classes within this system of the racial hierarchy in the antebellum South. So clearly, you didn't have to simply own a slave or be a slave owner or an overseer or something like that to benefit from the privilege that came from being in what Cobb noted, or what Cobb called, the superior race, the superior class of people. And this goes on, and he talks about this when it comes to violence committed against slaves by someone other than their master, right? He talks, it would seem that from the very nature of slavery and the degraded social position of the slave, many acts would extenuate the homicide of a slave and reduce the offense to a lower grade, which would not constitute legal provocation if done by a white person. So what he's about to say here, what he's talking about is, if someone were to kill a slave, and a white person were to kill a slave, there are ways, legal ways, that would lower that from a homicide to some lesser crime simply because the victim was a slave. And he'll explain what he means by that. So thus it was held competent for one charged with the murder of a slave to give in evidence that the deceased was turbulent and insolent and imprudent to a white person. So in the case that he cites, he cites a case called State v. Tackett. He says that in this case, a white person was charged with the murder of a slave, but the white person then brings his evidence, he was insolent, he was insubordinate, and he was being imprudent to me, a white person, that's why I killed him. And that was able to lower the charge from murder to a lesser charge. So simply because of the state of someone being enslaved, things that happen to them would not be held to the same level as if it occurred between two white people. And it gets even worse. And an assault or striking by a slave would, in many cases, amount to a justification of a homicide, which, in a white person, would only mitigate the offense. So what he's saying here is, if two white people were to strike each other, and one person killed the other, then that would be a crime. There'd be a higher level of crime here. However, if a slave were to hit a white person, and the white person were to kill that slave, that could not be considered the same level of criminality as if done between two white people. Because how dare a slave strike a white person? And in that situation, the reaction of the white person being of the superior race, as I cited before, his reaction of being struck by this inferior race who should have no right to put their hands on a white person, if the white person were to go and kill that slave, then that would not be the same level of criminality as if it happened between two white people. So I'm merely trying to show in the lesson today that within the corpus of antebellum slave law, it was clear it created a racial hierarchy that all white people benefited from. You didn't simply have to be one of the 31% that owned a slave, or one of the 2% that owned 200 plus slaves and big plantations. All white people in the South benefited from the privilege of the system of slavery, of racial-based slavery, of the slavery of people of African descent. So the argument that is used by many Confederate apologetics who say not all white people own slaves, you can agree that's 100% true. Not all white people own slaves. However, all white people, and I'm even going so far as to say that, I hate to use absolutes in terms of law or teaching or anything like that, but for the most part, all white people benefited from the institution of African slavery and the privilege that it gave to all white people living within the antebellum South. And that is clearly seen in Thomas Cobb's exposition and explanation of the laws of slavery in the South. That simply because of their position as the superior race, as the race of enslavers, the white race, simply because of that position, all people in that race are afforded power and authority over enslaved individuals in order for the system to work. So again, I know this is very difficult to hear. It's a very difficult topic to study, but that's why it needs to be done. That's why I've made this my area of scholarly research, the things that I teach, because we tend to just hear slavery was bad and slavery was horrible. But until you actually read what was written by the people in the time and what was done to enslave people, which will be the topic for the next lesson, brutality against enslaved individuals and how far that went, and the fake protections that the law and the courts pretended to provide for slaves, until you actually understand this and you understand how the system was truly 100% racially based on a system of white supremacy, you can't know how, you can't believe how bad it was. And then you can't understand how it progressed from slavery to the 13th Amendment to Jim Crow to systemic racism within the judicial system itself to where we are today, unless you actually go back and study these laws, these codes, these acts, these court decisions during the antebellum South. So please remember, like, subscribe, share the videos, and I'll see you for the next lesson.